Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to the second part of our summer webinar series on what has proven to be a very popular topic indeed, GDPR. By means of a quick introduction, my name is Anton Richter, and I am the CEO of M3's Global Market Research business. When we were planning this webinar series, we fully expected everyone to have reached peak GDPR fatigue by now. So no one was more surprised than us when nearly 400 people signed up for this webinar. Still a very popular topic, it would seem. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by M3's rather busy and expert compliance team, who have been working tirelessly on getting us all ready for the implementation and execution of GDPR. We have Mo Rice, our SVP of Sales, who has been with M3 since 2011. She has worked in market research for longer than she'll allow me to mention, and is a member of the BHBIA Ethics Committee. Next up, we have Neil Phillips, our Head of Data. Neil has brought nearly 30 years of market research experience to M3, sorry Neil, and is responsible for enhancing and leveraging M3's data assets, with quality and compliance very much at the fore of his work. We also have Jana Rutten, our Director of Operations here in London. Jana joined M3 back in 2014, same year as me, and heads up our European compliance team, with a strong background in ISO accreditation. Lastly, our sincere thanks to Hannah Brown, our Marketing Director, for being the inspiration behind this series and facilitating today's event. Hannah will close up our webinar and also moderate the Q&A for us. So, now that the dust has finally settled, and those hundreds of GDPR Day breakup emails, aka Y2K, are a distant memory, we want to spend the next half hour or so discussing some of the key ways that GDPR is impacting our industry, and look to demystify some of the more complex topics within Fieldwork. For those of you that still remember when adverse event reporting first came onto the horizons, we see a very similar pattern with the advent of GDPR. Back then, there was also a lack of clear instruction leading to confusion, which when combined with conflicting requirements, did seem to be an insurmountable barrier to business. But for all of us now today, adverse event reporting is part of our daily lives, and the industry has moved on. And so we will again, eventually, emerge from under GDPR. Here at M3, we don't profess to have all the answers, but we do intend to show you how we've interpreted and applied the regulation, in the hope that as an industry, we can jointly adopt a sensible, proportionate, and pragmatic response to GDPR that delivers data protection whilst allowing our businesses to flourish. So first up on our agenda will be a discussion around the issues raised by end client identification, before we then move on to the impact on qual viewing. After that, we will tackle list matching, before we cover off adverse event reporting and take a quick look at supplier selection. We have allowed some time for questions at the end, but please do submit any of them at any point during the webinar using the Q&A chat console, which hopefully is on your right-hand side of the screen. And Hannah will take note of these for us for the end. I wish you all an informative session and pass you over shortly to my colleague Neil to walk you through our first topic, end client identification in market research. But before that, please take note of the following important slide. It wouldn't be a GDPR session without it.
Okay, thanks, Anton. I'll just leave that up for a second for people to digest, and then we'll start on the end client identification piece. Okay, so just to give a little background to the end client identification, it really kicked off with the MRS, the BHBIA, and slightly later ephemera, all providing feedback on some discussions that have been had with the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, who are the regulator for GDPR in the UK. And then subsequently, there were further meetings with the European Data Protection Board, who are really the committee, if you like, of all the regulators from each of the countries in the EU. And so it raised it to a European level. And The feedback they provided has been widely taken to mean that end clients must be named in all market research surveys in Europe. And what we'd like to do in this section of today's webinar is look at where we think that applies and how and why, and where we think it perhaps doesn't apply and why. And those will be the kind of the focus for the next few slides. So the first scenario I'd like to look at is where personal data is collected as part of the survey design. So that means literally one of the questions in the survey is a name, address, a phone number, or some other combination of data points that would come together to identify someone. So perhaps if we were interviewing chief of radiologists and we asked for the name of the hospital, then essentially you've identified all of those people. So that's the scenario we're talking about. And just to take you through the layout of this slide, what we've done is break down the whole project, if you like, the whole survey process into 3 columns. And each of those is an independent activity that's kind of linked together in a chain. And it's important that we understand why I'm regarding them as independent. It's because they have separate purposes and separate means. And that's a key phrase within GDPR. So let's walk through the first common column, which is the survey content. And we've said in this scenario, we're assuming personal data is collected. And because personal data is collected, it needs a controller. And the controller has to be the people that design the survey. So it will largely be the MR agency, but it may also well be the end client. And the possibly there really is determined by the degree of collaboration between the end client and the MR agency. The more that they're involved together, the more likely it is that the end client would need to be included within the data controllers. And whoever is a data controller must be named when the data is collected. That's all very clear. If those people, having designed the survey, then hand the survey over to someone to host it, say in an online web-based survey, then the person hosting it may collect further personal data for their own purposes and by their own design. So, for example, they may collect IP addresses, they may place cookies. And so, but those weren't part of the original purpose and original design. So that's why it's a separate activity, albeit joined together in a chain. And similarly, the company or the part of the process that's dealing with participant recruitment is also separate, in the sense there that those individuals are recruited, and that wasn't necessarily controlled or designed by the way that the original survey was designed. Just a note that the survey hosting company, for practical purposes, is very often the MR agency or the fieldwork agency. It is occasionally it happens it's a third party, which is one of the reasons for breaking it out here. So that scenario very much describes what some of you may well be familiar with this paragraph, which is the guidance that was echoed to us by the MRS, FAMR, and BHBIA. And it really says in 2 pieces. Firstly, you can be regarded as a joint controller of data, regardless of whether one controller determines the purpose and the other the means. So the question that this guidance came from was, well, it's the end client who is determining the overall purpose, why the thing's being done. But it's the market research agency that's determining actually how it will be done, the details, and in this case, technically the means. And what the EDPS group have come back and said is that it doesn't matter if it's one or the other. It's if you determine one or the other, you are both joint controllers. It's not, you can't split it in that way. They went on to say that in a joint controller scenario, where personal data are collected from data subjects, both controllers must be named. And that's an important clarification to Article 13 of the GDPR, which was always written in the singular, that when you are a data controller and you collect data, you must. And it's been clarified to be if there are joint controllers, then they both must be named. So that's really the guidance that came out from that group and where we think it applies. Let's look at a second scenario where personal data is now not collected as part of the survey design. And we do have to be careful here to make sure that we're not collecting personal data as a result, accidentally, if you like, as a result of combinations of questions. So that's important to bear in mind. But if it's definitely not, then there is no personal data being collected, the blue cross in that first column. And because there is no personal data being collected, there is no controller for it, and therefore no controller to be named. It doesn't mean that the other columns don't apply. They most certainly do. And so anyone hosting the survey and collecting personal data for that purpose would need to be named, and anyone doing the recruitment and managing that process would need to be named. But it's a very different scenario. So why do we believe we can say this? What's our basis for this? Well, two things. Let's deal with why we don't believe there's any, GDPR doesn't apply when there's no personal data collected. We can refer back to the recital 26, which actually, just a quick note on recitals, they are guidance built into GDPR on how to interpret it. And they were built in when the regulations were drawn up by the same parties. And it basically says, if the data is anonymous, the regulation doesn't apply. So that's very clear and very simple. And then we have the question of why can we break it up into that chain that I was describing? And why aren't they all joint controllers, if you like? And the EDPS, at that point named the Article 29 Working Group, issued some guidance back in 2010. And let me just read it through. It says, first of all, the mere fact that different subjects, bodies, companies perhaps in this case, cooperate in processing personal data, for example, in a chain, as we've been describing, does not entail that they are joint controllers in all cases, since the exchange of data between two parties without sharing purpose or means, which I think we've discussed that we probably don't, in a common set of operations should be considered only as transfers between the separate controllers. And so that's the important aspect of why we believe we can break it up. Unfortunately, with all things GDPR, it's not quite that straightforward. There is a large gray area of when two parties start to share a purpose and a means, becoming joint controllers, rather than sharing data with separate purposes, and so being separate controllers. And what probably is the most useful thing for everyone to do is to follow the reference below the quote I had on the previous slide. And there are, I believe it's about 10 different examples in that document that describe different situations where you might be considered joint or not joint controllers. And they're very, very informative, even if the rest of the document is a little hard going. And then, of course, we should be very wary to document all our decisions, as with most things GDPR. And just remember the BHBIA advice on this, that the determination of who is a data controller, joint controller, or processor is a question of fact, not of contractual stipulation. We have seen contracts around in the industry where people by contract are trying to say, we will be controller and you will be processor, or vice versa. And to be blunt, it's actually a question of the facts, not what's in the contracts. And it boils down to who is determining the means in the process and who has the decision-making power. So in practice, what are we doing at M3? Well, two things really. To the extent that our clients, and they are the best people to judge, who have developed a questionnaire, believe it collects personal data and want to be named because they need to be, then we will clearly support that and make that possible. There are scenarios where, in doing so, it becomes a little unclear what M3 is doing in terms of releasing our members' data to those parties. So we will sometimes ask for clarity to be put in there, more of what we're not doing than what we are doing. But on the flip side, if our clients believe they're not collecting personal data, and we believe that's hopefully the case in most of the surveys we design, then they can't be controllers of it. There's no need to name them, and we're very happy to support that scenario as well. And I do say again, and I forgive my repetition, do document it and do document the rationale. It's a terribly important thing with all things GDPR. Okay, So I'm going to hand over to Mo to talk about some other areas where identifying the client may become important, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit about how lists might impact the whole thing. Mo?
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Neil. So I'm going to talk through qualitative research viewing guidance with you, which I know has been a pain point for many. Here, I'm going to look at voice as personal data and also image as personal data. ESMAR, MRS and AFAMRO guidance is that sound and video recordings and still images should always be considered as personal data. This is in the light of the ease of linking these to a person. Ease of technology in doing this means that there's a higher risk of re-identification of this type of materials. So if you think about where you have very small Dr. Universe sizes, you can have KOLs, you can have payers, and often identifying their voice could be very easy. We have seen as well in the past where brand managers are viewing or listening into research, and often a brand manager is an ex-sales rep and can recognize a doctor's voice. Voice can be distinctive, especially with an accent. So, the Swedish Data Protection Authority have provided guidance that voice should be considered as personal data. Others, to our knowledge, have not provided specific guidance. But in the absence of the lack of guidance, it does not mean it is allowed. It literally just means there is no guidance. So looking at image, we're unaware of any specific guidance, but believe it is self-evident that an image of somebody's face is sufficient to identify them, and so should be considered as personal data. Now, we're going to look at in-person viewing. So consent must be obtained for participation and any viewing or recording at the start of the interview. Also remember, at recruitment, this should also be disclosed and informed to the respondent so there are no later surprises. However, the end client does not need to be named for their in-person viewing, so if they are in the back room, as data is not transferred to them and they are not processing or controlling any personal data. Therefore, GDPR does not apply to this particular activity. If we look at what the BHBIA legal and ethical guidelines require, for live viewing via a one-way mirror or sitting in, you must tell respondents that the end client will observe them, and respondents must consent to this beforehand. In this situation, personal data isn't being transferred to the end client. The data protection legislation does not apply, and so the end client may remain anonymous unless you are legally obliged to reveal their identity for another reason. And this could be such as the end client is a data controller, or the end client supplies the sample. So before Fieldwork starts, you should agree and document the client position on whether you can reveal their identity to respondents, if it's requested, and if it can be revealed, when, during or at the end of the interview. You should reflect this in the screener and the interview materials so that interviewers can also react appropriately. Now, I'm going to repeat what Neil has said because it is very important. Do remember to document all decisions and rationale behind them. So, now we're going to take a look at live remote viewing. Now, this is considered a transfer of data to those viewing, so this must be consented before it happens. All organisations receiving the data must be named as part of that consent process. And again, if we look at the BHBIA legal and ethical guidelines, what they require for live viewing via video relay streaming with and without recording. Data protection requirements mean you must name the organisation viewing before the transfer of personal data takes place. So, for example, the end client is viewing Fieldwork live via a video stream. The client's identity must be revealed before Fieldwork as part of the information communicated to secure respondents' informed consent. Also, remember here, you have to consider the location of viewers to ensure no transfer to a third country that does not have appropriate safeguards in place. Now we're going to look at recordings. Transferring copies of recordings are considered as transfer of data to those receiving them, and this must be consented before it happens. All organisations receiving the data must be named as part of the consent process. Now, if this would undermine the integrity of the research, consent for transferring to the end client may be done at the end of the interview, but again, document the decision and the rationale behind it. When we look at the BHBIA legal and ethical guidelines, delayed viewing via video relay, including video streaming, with and without recording. If the end client wants to view or listen into Fieldwork after it has taken place, consent for this must be secured before the interview, but the client's identity may be disclosed at the end of the interview, but before any personal data is shared with the client. This is in the case if naming the client before would undermine the integrity of the market research. But please do bear in mind, respondents must be made aware at recruitment that the client will be named at the end of the interview, and they can also withdraw their consent at any point. Again, the justification for this should be documented. It's that theme of document, document, document. And also remember, in the instance of focus groups, if you have a refusal, then you cannot share that recording. So, now we're all familiar with the guidance, or in some cases, the lack of guidance. What are our options? What solutions do we have for you? Well, if transcripts are redacted of any personal data, then consent to transfer these is not required. Simultaneous translators can be used to remove the voice of respondents and thus that aspect of personal data. There's technical means that can distort voices sufficiently enough to make them unrecognisable. There's pixelation or blurring of faces that can be used on video to remove this aspect of personal data. So there is light at the end of the tunnel. Now I'm going to hand back to Neil, who's going to discuss that hot topic of list handling.
Thanks, Mo. So let's just put a couple of assumptions in place around lists. We're going to assume that the end client is the data controller of their lists, which is a reasonable assumption, and that the fieldwork agency would be the data processor of that same list. And then, as required by GDPR, the data controller provides instructions to the processor of what they want them to do. And just as an aside, if the data processor wants to appoint a subcontractor, then it's important for them to realize that they need written permission from the data controllers to do so. And I don't think many data controllers would probably provide that without knowing who those parties were. So Jana will talk a little bit more about some of the implications for that later. So we're going to look at a couple of scenarios around lists. One is around when the instruction from the data controller is to a fieldwork agency is to match the list against their own internal list of market research respondents and invite those that match, i.e. those that they've already got a relationship with. And then we'll look at what happens if the instruction includes for the list to be used directly to recruit MR respondents. So the first of those, we'll just start off by just kind of laying out some of the framework for why we think the position we've come to. We manage a panel of healthcare professionals, patients, and consumers for the purposes of inviting them to participate in research. That's our purpose, and we do it by our own means, as in we decide how we do that. So we alone are the data controllers of that data. When a client provides a list for us to match, that's a separate activity from that ongoing operation of the panel. We process the list on the behalf of the clients according to their instructions, but we invite people to participate in the surveys according to our own processes and indeed using our own data. It's unusual that a client list will include an email address, but it is normal that we invite people to participate in surveys via email. So we're not actually using the contact details from the list in order to invite people. And because of that, the list owner, we believe, does not need to be named as the data source because of the way we're behaving and the way we're acting. So that's the simple scenario. The scenario around a custom recruitment, so that scenario where we're recruiting directly from the list, is a little bit more complicated. If we were to become a data controller of that list, and I don't think we do, then according to GDPR, we must tell the data subject the source of the data, i.e. the end client. So we would in that case have to reveal the identity of the client. However, if we're a data processor, then GDPR requires us, in this kind of scenario at least, or this aspect, to only follow the lawful instructions of the data controller. And there doesn't seem to be anything in GDPR that says a data processor must identify themselves. However, the e-privacy regulations, or PECA in the UK, require you to identify yourself if you're conducting marketing, and that's probably considered a joint between the processor and the controller if the processor is doing the contacting. Although it's important to say that market research is not considered marketing, at least in the UK. So a bit of a mixed bag and a bit of a confused picture. And that's really the situation around this custom recruitment right now. The market research guidelines I've listed here on the slide are simpler, and they are at the beginning. It says that we must name individuals if we must tell individuals the source of their name if it's from a list from the sample. The source of the list must be revealed. It then goes on to say in Germany, we must tell people. In Finland, we must not. So it's a little bit more complicated. But the reality is the market research guidelines are very much in favor of if the individual is recruited from a list, we must tell them the source of the list. I think this is an area that will continue to evolve. And I believe there will be solutions to this that various companies will develop over time. So I think this is probably an area to watch, but for now, I believe our guidance would be that we would need to identify people when we do recruitment directly from a list. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Jana to talk about the last two topics, which are adverse event reporting and supplier selection.
Thank you, Neil. Next, we're going to be talking about another area that is very important and that many of us come into contact with on a near daily basis. And that is the wonderful topic of adverse event reporting. So there are two particular aspects of GDPR that have influenced our thinking when we were reviewing our processes and procedures in this particular area. The first one is privacy by design and default. And what this means is that you need to consider data protection and privacy issues up front in everything that you do. And you don't just have to consider it, but also put into place appropriate technical and organizational measures to safeguard individual rights and implement data protection principles. So adverse event reporting can't be an afterthought, and we do need to have a plan in place from the beginning. And well, then of course we need to follow that plan as well. The other tenet of GDPR that we are considering is data minimization. So the concept that the personal data we process is adequate, relevant, and limited to what is actually necessary. For example, if we were to collect the personal details at the beginning of a survey of all respondents, just in case an adverse event is mentioned, that would very likely not be in line with this principle. Or, for example, if reporter details are shared through intermediaries, this would also contradict this particular principle. Now, as we know, we need to know and document the legal basis for processing and transferring personal data, and this includes the transfer of reporter details over to pharmacovigilance. We are assuming that the legal basis for this is consent, and have thus far not heard of a different legal basis to rely on. Now, as we do rely on consent, this must be informed consent that Mo spoke about earlier as well. So respondents need to actually know where their data is going. We believe that this informed consent can be given specific to the adverse event and does not need to be part of the survey itself. Therefore, SM3, we are following this flow for the adverse event reporting, depending on when in the project cycle an adverse event is identified. In either of those scenarios, consent in principle is given at the recruitment/screening stage. In the first scenario on the left, we're looking at an adverse event identified during an interview, for example, when a TDI is conducted. In this scenario, at the end of the interview, the moderator can ask relevant additional information from the respondent, and the sponsoring pharmaceutical company can be named so that respondent's details can be shared with pharmacovigilance, given that they agree to it. If the respondent refuses to give consent at this point, the report will still be sent, but without his details. Importantly, the report will also be sent directly and not through any intermediary. Now, there are also cases when adverse event is identified after an interview or after the fieldwork, for example, when the data from an online survey is being reviewed afterwards. In this case, to not delay any reporting, a report is still filed as usual, but without the reporter details. If the PV team then do want to follow up with a particular respondent, it's the fieldwork agency that will at that point seek informed consent from the respondent, so that includes naming the pharma client as well. If the respondent consents, at that point, his or her details will be passed on to the PV team. We've been following this process since around the middle of May, and we're happy to say that it has been running smoothly as well. So in the final section today, we're looking at supplier selection. And in this, we're looking specifically at data controller responsibilities when selecting data processors. And also we're looking at requirements that are specific to non-EEA controllers or processors. So in Fieldwork, it can be the case that a controller contracts a supplier that would process personal data for them. And I'm sure we could all think of a lot of examples where this happens, but I'll just mention one each for qualitative and quantitative research. So on the qual side, a moderator, for example, may be contracted who receives the respondent's contact details so that they can go to the hospital and actually conduct an interview. On the quantitative side, I might be sharing an exclusion list with a contracted vendor to avoid us recruiting the same people. In that case, even though the data points that I submit are quite limited, this still does count as personal information. And in these examples, as well as all other scenarios where a vendor processes data for me, I've quite broad responsibilities of care when I select my vendor. So this includes guarantees of compliance to GDPR standards from the vendor, but I also need to actually believe that they're capable of it, have sufficient knowledge, and have the required resources available as well. Based on that, it may be advisable to, in addition to contractual agreements, to have a defined but documented vetting process for vendors in place, and to conduct regular audits and document the outcomes of those as well. Lastly, if we look at overseas controllers or processors, they are not simply off the hook by being outside of the EEA. Instead, if any company controls or processes personal data of EU residents, they must comply with GDPR. There can be a requirement to appoint a data protection officer, for example, if there's large-scale processing taking place, and a recommendation has actually been provided that they be physically located within the EU. There also needs to be a representative within the EEA to coordinate with local data protection authorities as required. Okay, I'll now hand over to Hannah.
Thanks, Jana, and thanks to Mo and Neil as well. It's a really interesting area, obviously, and I think they've done a great job at simplifying some of the trickier areas affecting the industry. So, a little bit of admin while the team draw breath and go through the questions that we've received while they've been talking. We've got time for a couple of questions, and then we'll reply offline to anything else that you want to ask. So if you think of anything afterwards, then you can email me. Mine's the email address that's in all the webinar admin emails that you get from Zoom. It's just hannah.brown@eu.m3.com, and we can get back to you. So if anything crops up, maybe when you're sharing the presentation with your teams, I'll send the presentation out in the next few days, both a copy of the slides and also an audio and video version of this presentation. So, I'm sure that you'll want to relive it as many times as you possibly can. Hopefully you've enjoyed this webinar. This is the second of 4 that we're running this summer. The next one's on the 22nd of August and covers what we've learned from building and maintaining patient communities for longitudinal studies. We've recently won a Bobby Award for Best Patient-Centric Approach for our work with the NHS and a project that we've been doing with them, building patient panels. And it's a real passion project for us, and we're learning so much. I'll send out a link to sign up for that as well when I send out the slides. Right, so now over to questions. So first up, if there was a hypothetical live streaming platform that allowed you to blur and distort voices, would that get me out of naming my clients? Mo, probably one for you, that one?
Yeah, and yes, that would get you out of naming your client because you would have distorted the voice and also the image. So it is essentially anonymous.
Perfect. Thanks, Mo. And this one's probably more for Neil. This question asks about maximising client lists, which is obviously a pain point for many people. How can you manage client list matching with multiple suppliers?
Yeah, it's one that comes up a lot. And it's the same as we described really for one when we were talking about list matching. I think the thing to be very careful of there is that, as I mentioned before, once you have to get permission to appoint a subcontractor, a sub-processor from the data controller. But then, as the data controller, and to the extent that you pass a list to someone else, you, for that purpose, become the data controller. You assume some of the liabilities that Jana was talking about. So you do have to select both your primary contractor and any subcontractors that they appoint as reputable companies in order that you avoid these problems.
Great. So unfortunately, that's all we've got time for. I've just noticed that some of the questions that have come in are anonymous. If we don't know who you are, then we can't get back to you afterwards. So if you can either send it to us again with your name attached to it, or just send it to me by email, then we'll be able to get a response to you on that in the next day or so. So again, thank you to all our presenters today, and thanks to you as well for giving up your time to attend. We hope you found it really useful and interesting. And as I said, we'll have the slides and a link to the presentation out to you in the next few days. Thank you very much. Enjoy your afternoons and evenings.